Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending. You're attending the Managing Ransomware Incidents in COVID Times. My name is Bill Dillon. I am the managing shareholder of the Tallahassee office of the Gunster law firm. And before I get into the introductions, I just want to do a little housekeeping. We are recording this webinar. You can view a replay on demand from the Gunster's COVID-19 website. The webinar will be posted tomorrow, and feel free to share it with others. You can also on that website, you can find other timely information related to the COVID-19 situation that we've been going through for quite some time. You can access this by going to gunster.com/COVID-19 no hyphen. At the end of the presentation, or while we're going through the presentation, we encourage you to submit any questions that you have through the question and answer feature on your screen. The questions will be sorted and read aloud anonymously and answered by the most appropriate presenter at the end of the presentation. So with that, let me go ahead and kick us off. Again, my name is Bill Dillon, and I am a healthcare attorney in the Gunster Tallahassee office, and I work with healthcare clients throughout the state, and a large portion of my practice is related to HIPAA and health information technology. And unfortunately, these last few years, quite frankly, doing a lot of data breach work and ransomware and things like that that are impacting the healthcare sector. You know, one of the things that I think is when we were planning this presentation, we were all seeing that we were seeing more of an occurrence of ransomware in the healthcare sector. And then sure enough, after we'd already scheduled the presentation, the FBI and HHS and other government authorities on October 29th sent out an alert basically saying that there are impending attacks on the healthcare system related to ransomware. So unfortunately, this is a very timely presentation given the current state of our environment, and we're very happy to be able to help you today. So joining me today along was one of my partners, Jonathan Osborne. Jonathan is in one of our South Florida office, Fort Lauderdale, and Jonathan has got just a tremendous resume. Jonathan is a former assistant United States attorney, and he's been involved in a lot of really interesting and exciting, sexy type cases, and he's done quite a bit now working with folks with business email compromise and in the cybersecurity area. And he's also going to be talking today about something new that came out from the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which is under the Department of Treasury, which impacts the actual payment of ransom if it ever comes to that situation. So, you know, Jonathan's going to have some interesting information for us. And then also, we're very fortunate to have with us colleagues from Kaufman and Rawson, CPA and advisors, to give us their expertise in this field. And I'm going to turn over the introductions to my colleague, Jorge Ray, on that. Jorge, go ahead and take it over.
Bill, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So, like Bill mentioned, ransomware is something that has created a lot of news in the past 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And I'm glad all of you guys are here right now watching this seminar. That means that you're taking ransomware seriously. Ransomware is one of those situations that it will have a big impact on your business. So if you don't have the right prevention strategies or techniques, could potentially bring your business for a day or 2 days or weeks or 2 weeks. We've had many clients that actually have suffered through ransomware attacks. So this is something that you don't want to take lightly. With me, we have Henry Fleffel. Henry is our red team leader, which means he actually does all the penetration testing for our clients. What does that mean is he goes ahead and does a lot of the vulnerability assessments, technical assessments, and then go ahead and do exploitations. This could be for a web application. This could be for a network. This could be a physical security penetration testing. Like Bill mentioned, I'm Jorge Ray. I head up our cybersecurity consulting division for Kaufman Rawson. We provide a lot of services to healthcare entities and business associates. So looking forward to being in this panel today. So In today's seminar, we're going to be looking at a couple of areas, correct? So we're going to tell you a little about how ransomware works. We will be providing you with, and Jonathan and Will tell you a little about the legalities and how to investigate ransomware if it occurs. And ultimately, we'll be providing you guys with some key prevention techniques to hopefully help you secure your environment. So saying that, Henry, would you like to tell us a little what ransomware is?
Of course. So in short, ransomware is, imagine like a computer virus, but basically its main objective is to encrypt your files. And then what's going to happen is they're going to ask for money in order to decrypt the files. The process, it could be relatively slow and hidden. It could be pretty obvious, and it usually comes with some sort of scare tactic or another element in order to further increase the chance that the victim will actually pay for the ransomware. In order to get these files back, a lot of times, like I said, it's just as simple as paying, and they will provide a decryption key. They will get the ransomware starting to just decrypt the files. But one of the new tendencies that we saw is that they are also stealing the files in order to further increase the chance of people paying, because now you don't only are trying to get your files back, you're also worried that the hackers will start selling this information on the dark web or just sharing it openly. And it might include private things from your clients, health records, and other things that are not supposed to be out there. As far as infection vectors, still one of the things we see that it's pretty common is to just attach it to an email or provide a link in an email so someone will click on it, go to an infected website, and then it will start affecting the computer. It will start infecting. A lot of times the other thing that it does is it will try to navigate through the network and infect as many computers as possible in order to maximize the chance of hitting something useful for the hackers. The idea is to try to get databases, domain controllers, whatever it is that it's important that has client data especially. That's the kind of stuff that they're going after. And phishing would be the terminology used for this. You received an email. It might have a PDF or a Word document with a malicious macro enabled. As I said, it could be a link to an infected website. And the other thing that we've seen a lot is chain supply infections. Basically, you rely on a third party in order to function. Let's say a managed service provider or something along those lines. You are paying a company to manage your servers, your computers, and what will happen is that if they get infected, then you also get infected. Now, what I would like to show you now is a ransomware in action. Basically, what you will see is, well, at first, not much. It's working on the background. It's encrypting files, and then it's going to show up. It's basically going to pop up with the message that normally you will see when infected with ransomware. So let's see, there it is. So what right now you're gonna see is basically just a Windows computer. In short, it's been purposely infected with ransomware. At first, like I said, it's gonna be hidden, it's gonna be running on the background. And eventually, once it's done encrypting all of your files, it's going to pop up with a message that usually has the instructions. What are these instructions? Normally, they explain how you can pay for the ransomware. And by far the most common method, and probably basically the only method that we've normally seen. You should now be seeing the pop-up from the ransomware. As I said, they usually try to employ scare tactics in order to increase the chance that the victim will pay. It will mention a couple of details like what is going on, your documents and pictures and other important files are being encrypted. They will let you know how much payment they're expecting, how you can pay, which is through cryptocurrencies. It used to be Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is traceable. So a lot of ransomware is now switching to Monero because it allows for a more it's harder to track for authorities. So it will make it easier for the hackers to get the money and not worry about being tracked. A lot of times it will also come with warnings of what will happen if you don't pay. A lot of times they have a clock running that will let you know you have a limited amount of time to pay before they just delete all the files and you won't be able to recover them. But of course, a common technique to protect from this would be to have your backups. So as long as you have your backups, you don't really need to pay, you just restore from the backups. And that's, like I said, the new technique that is showing up is they're gonna copy your files. If you have backups and restore from the backups, they're still gonna threaten about sharing private information online. So as you can see in the video, the instructions just go through the different details, amount of payment expected, how you can pay. In many cases, they will actually provide instructions on how to create your own cryptocurrency wallet so that you can actually have a way to pay them. And right here, you see the clock is basically telling you that you have just 1 hour before this particular ransomware will start deleting random files every hour. And it's actually incremental. So the first hour is going to delete just 1 file. Second hour is going to delete 2 files. Third hour is going to delete 4 files. And it's just keep growing exponentially. So at this point, basically, your only option will be, like I said, either to pay or to restore from backups. Sadly, a lot of times, and what we're seeing right now, is at the very least 1 in every 10 ransomware attacks also involves stealing data so that they can actually threaten with that too. In particular here, you can see that all of the files have been changed. At simple view, they just seem like they have different extensions, but of course they're encrypted. So right now I want to leave it back to Bill.
Right. Thank you, Henry. That was, and for those of you that have had to go through this, I'm sorry. I know I've had clients that have had to deal with the that scary screen, and there's different versions of the screen, and it's got to be a horrible feeling. And I hear stories of people running through the office and ripping cords out of walls and doing everything. And unfortunately, by that time, it's too late. So once we've gotten to that stage, unfortunately, it's happened. We haven't prevented it for whatever reason, and we'll figure out why we didn't prevent it in the postmortem. When we try to figure out what happened, we'll figure it out. But it's happened. So what do we do now? So now we really enter into the next phase, which is the investigation phase and the reporting of the ransomware phase. And so one of the first things that you should do, and again, this webinar is targeted to the healthcare industry. So you're going to be more than likely, unless you're a rare exception, you're going to be covered by the HIPAA privacy and security rules. And you're going to be expected already to have security incident procedures already in place to mitigate any known harmful effects that occur. So hopefully you've got that. As we'll discuss going forward, that's one of the things we still see when we're responding to these and we get in with the healthcare clients. Even though HIPAA has been around for many, many years, we're still falling down on having appropriate security policies and procedures and things to deal with. And I may be dating myself by saying this, but I often think of when I was in high school in the movie War Games, and a hacker going in and getting into the computer systems and things like that. And it was a real big thing. And wow, how can you stop that? It's just a really smart person. Those days are gone. We know in all industry sectors, but particularly in healthcare, we know that individuals are trying to steal your data, and you're expected to take appropriate responses to protect your data, protect your patient's data, and be able to handle security incidents when they occur. So, again, the first thing we do when we find out that this has happened is we go ahead and we activate the entity's security incident procedures, and we start trying to mitigate the situation as much as we can. In order to mitigate, entities will often use both internal and external assets to mitigate and respond to ransomware. And a lot of times that's based on the size of the entity. So I have physician practices that I've worked with, and all of the assets that they would use would be outside assets because they don't have internal IT teams to assist them with this. So they're going to be totally relying on third-party vendors. Other large health systems have an entire health IT team and security team and are able to do a lot more of the things to mitigate problems from the inside. So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna activate our IT response team, our security response team. We want to bring into loop any of our compliance folks that are needed. So again, recall, we don't just have a privacy officer, we also have a security officer. Sometimes that can also be the chief information officer. We want to bring that individual in and their team in to start working with this. And then in many instances, you're going to want to bring in either your internal or outside legal assistance because unfortunately there are, depending on where you're located and the type of incident that occurs, there are legal ramifications and there are regulatory notification obligations. Once we've got our team assembled internally, we also want to, or externally, we also want to, one of the next steps is we want to notify our cyber liability carrier. Hopefully, in this day and age, everybody has got cyber liability insurance. Again, 7-8 years ago, it was sort of a novel concept, and not everybody had it. I'm finding that in my practice to be increasingly rare because people understand the risk. So you want to make sure that once you've determined that we really do have a legitimate security incident, we want to go ahead and we want to notify our cyber liability carrier, because in many instances, the policies have notification windows. And quite frankly, you don't want to start incurring expenses that may not be covered by your insurance product. In many instances, the insurance carriers will have panels of experts, not just attorneys, but IT experts to help you deal with the ransomware attack. I know in one that I worked with earlier in this year, they actually had a team of individuals who would negotiate with the threat actors who happened to be in Eastern Europe and negotiated the entire transaction with regard to the encrypting of the files. As Henry said, that's they've encrypted your data, but you don't just want to pay them because first of all, we want to make sure that they can actually unlock the data and give you your data back. The other thing, however, though, as Henry mentioned, that we're starting to see a lot more of, or I'm seeing certainly, they're not just encrypting the data; they're also making copies of the data and threatening to sell it on the dark web. So they've just like everything else, the threat actors have improved their business model and they've gotten more efficient as we've gotten more efficient in trying to mitigate what the attacks that they're doing. The other thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to notify law enforcement. Normally, that's going to be, at least in my experience, you're going to be working with the FBI. There are some local law enforcement, and my clients will often notify local law enforcement, but it's really hit or miss as to whether or not they have the capabilities to assist. And oftentimes they will bring in the FBI. Here in Florida, one of the other groups that we've worked with before is the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and they work closely with the FBI. So, we want to bring in local law enforcement. And oftentimes there's not much they can do, but they can at least be helpful because they may know who the threat actor is. They may be able to assist you in understanding whether or not they've dealt with this particular bad guy in the past or not. And that could become relevant as we move forward, and whether as the business has to try to make the decision to potentially pay ransomware. Now, of course, when we get to Jonathan's going to talk about a new wrinkle that just recently occurred with paying ransom that is now another factor that we have to consider. We also want to go ahead and implement our contingency plan. So that would be our data backup plan, our disaster recovery plan, and our emergency mode operation plan. Again, these are all requirements under the HIPAA security rules. As covered healthcare entities, you should already have these in place. As Henry mentioned about the data backup, when they were just locking the files down and encrypting the files, organizations that had the data backed up were in a pretty good spot because they could try to get their systems back up and running because they had a copy of the data. Now that's not as helpful if they're also threatening, if they're copying data and threatening to release it. You should also have in place a disaster recovery plan. What are we going to do once this happens? We know that these bad guys are out there. How do we plan to operate when something like this occurs? And I would note that is not just for ransomware, but for other issues as well. We live in Florida. We get hurricanes. Things happen. We know they're going to happen. We need to make sure that we're prepared to respond in the event of a disaster. An interesting story relating to disaster recovery and having, being able to get back up and running really comes out of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. We all recall what a devastating storm that was. And, the healthcare industry was particularly hard impacted in New Orleans. But one shining star out of that was the Veterans Administration. Because they had an electronic health record system in place, and because they had redundancy throughout their national system, although patients were scattered to the winds, in Houston and Tallahassee and Atlanta, all over the country, those patients were able to start receiving treatment again very shortly because the VA systems were not down that long, as opposed to others in the New Orleans area where their systems were totally destroyed by Hurricane Katrina. So at the time, that was a bright, shining moment. Now in 2020, almost 2021, that's an expectation that you need to be up and running again. We know disasters are going to occur. We need to know how to work through those. That goes to our emergency mode operations plan. And then we need to make sure that we're able to continue to provide the services that we so desperately need. And so in your sector, obviously healthcare services, we can't shut down healthcare services because our systems are locked down. We need to be able to get up and running and serve our patients as quickly as possible. So once we've done that, and we've gone ahead and put in our mitigation section, then we've got to kind of look at this is kind of the tough side of the lawyer side. We have to decide how we're going to handle the different breach reporting. And in Florida, we've actually got two sets of laws we need to worry about. So on the federal side, all of us that are covered entities, we need to worry about HIPAA and making an answer, determining whether or not a breach occurred. And then we also need to deal with the Florida Information Protection Act. And the breach definitions are not exactly the same. So under Florida law, a breach is essentially an unauthorized access or disclosure of electronic data that involves an individual's first name or initial and their last name, along with one of 5 different types of identifiers. Could be social security number, could be a financial account number with password, things like that. Whereas in HIPAA, it's any unauthorized access, use, or disclosure of protected health information. So for those of you in the healthcare sector, you know that protected health information is not just your name and your social security number. There are lots of 19 different components that could be considered identifiers that we potentially have to deal with. Then we need to go forward and we need to determine whether or not how we're going to do notifications to individuals. So, and here's where there's a real difference between HIPAA and the Florida law, FIPA. So in HIPAA, whether or not an individual is required to be notified really relates on whether or not the information itself was compromised. Okay. Previously, prior to the Affordable Care Act or to the Affordable Care Act changes and the high-tech amendments, under HIPAA, we went to this almost like a risk of harm to the individual analysis. Was there any risk of reputational or financial harm to the individual? And if there wasn't, then perhaps we could justify not providing notice to the individuals. Now, as somebody that worked through these notifications, I can tell you that the process was all over the place. It was not at all consistent. And you certainly had a reason to work really hard to come up and say, well, I don't think that this is going to pose any reputational or financial threat to any individual. I don't think it's going to create a risk of identity theft. And so they changed it to focus more on whether or not the information itself was compromised. Under Florida law, however, it's really we look to the standard of whether or not there's a risk of identity theft or financial or reputational harm. So it's a little bit of the older standard and quite not as comprehensive and not quite as broad. That said, for those of you in the healthcare sector, you're going to have to adhere to the HIPAA side. And so you're going to have to go through and you're really going to have to focus on the information. If it's determined to be a breach, you're going to have to provide notice to the individual. Under HIPAA, you're going to have to provide notice no later than 60 days. However, realize it says in the regulations, it says as soon as possible, or as soon as reasonably possible, but no later than 60 days. This is so the individuals can take care of themselves. I oftentimes have clients that say, oh, well, I get 60 days to do the notifications. Like, no, that's not correct. I mean, that's the outer limit. You really should be working to provide notification to the individual as promptly as possible. Now, that said, it's oftentimes, it does take longer than you think, but you want to make sure that you're going through the process with all due haste. The notification standard under Florida law is for non-healthcare entity, non-HIPAA covered entities is 30 days. However, under the Florida law, it defers to what's called in the statute your functional federal regulator. So if you're a covered entity under HIPAA, you're going to be using the HIPAA notification standards. Under HIPAA, if the breach involves more than 500 individuals, we're going to have to do notifications to the media. We're going to have to put things on our website. It's a little bit different than what's required under Florida law. In fact, in Florida law, you're not required to notify the Attorney General unless there's more than 500 individuals who are impacted by the breach. Doesn't mean you don't have to notify the individuals. It just means you don't have to notify the Florida Attorney General's office. I will say, in working with the Florida Attorney General's office, they are very helpful in working with covered entities and businesses that are trying to do the right things, because what they're trying to do is make sure that the AG is trying to make sure that consumers are protected and their information is protected. So from that standpoint, the Florida AG is very, very good to work with. And then we have to determine, when is notification to HHS required? So in the case of HIPAA, if we have a breach that involves 500 or less than 500 individuals, we have to provide notification to HHS no later than 60 days following the beginning of the next calendar year. Most of my clients try to do it contemporaneously just so that they don't mess up and forget to make the notification. If the breach is 500 or more, the notification to HHS needs to be made concurrently with the notification to the individuals. The sad thing, and nobody wants to be here, but if the breach is more than 500, you are going to end up on the HIPAA wall of shame because the breach is going to be on their public website. And it's probably going to get you a call or a letter from the Office of Civil Rights. On this slide, I just briefly want to kind of touch on some of the potential violations, the regulatory violations that are applicable or could be applicable in a ransomware attack. And when you look through the four-tiered penalty structure, you'll notice that it goes from the covered entity having really no knowledge that they were doing something wrong to willful neglect and not corrected. So this is, we covered entity knew we weren't doing things the right way. We knew we were making mistakes and we didn't fix it. And you'll see that happens quite frequently. You'll see in some of the larger settlements, there will be instances where perhaps a data breach caused OCR to come in and take a look at their entire program and come to find out that the entity had done a risk assessment, a risk analysis, and had identified weaknesses and didn't do anything to correct those weaknesses. That's not good, you know. So realize that the penalty or the violations and the regulatory penalties can be greater the more culpability that the entity has. Just briefly, looking at some of the Florida Information Protection Act violations. They're really focused, the violations are really focused on whether or not you made appropriate notice to the individuals and if you made it timely. So those are a little bit easier to avoid, you know, and one of the next things of these next couple of slides, I just want to kind of reiterate for the HIPAA covered entities out there, what you're required to have in place right now. You're required to have administrative, physical, and technical safeguards in place right now. And one of the first things that will happen when you get that letter from the Office of Civil Rights that's looking into a HIPAA matter, whether it's a breach or a complaint, is you're going to, you know, they're going to almost always request a copy of your policies and procedures. And they're going to expect that you have all of these in there and that you've addressed these various different areas. And so what I want to make sure that we understand is that, you know, don't just say, oh, well, my IT guy does that or my IT vendor takes care of that. This is your responsibility as a covered entity. I think the larger covered entities, the large health systems are really good at this, but the smaller we get, the smaller the entity gets, it's more hit or miss as to whether or not we have these in place. And that's not going to be an excuse. If you're a HIPAA covered entity, you're going to need to have these in place. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to have the same level of technology and same level of safeguards as, let's say, a large system like Advent Health or something like that. But it does mean that you're going to have to have addressed each of these issues. So, you know, again, you know, and I feel kind of bad because I always do these two slides and I've been doing it for the last 10 years and it's like pulling teeth. I really just want healthcare clients and people in the healthcare sector to understand that you need to have these in place, that you need to take the time and go through your systems. And you know, and it doesn't cost an arm and a leg to do that, but you do need to do it. It's an expectation. It's a requirement. So with that, I'm going to kind of move over and hand it off to my partner, Jonathan, to talk about some additional exposures that could occur with regard to ransomware events and in facilitating ransomware payments. So Jonathan, please take over.
Thank you, Bill, and good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to give a quick reminder that there is a Q&A box. So if anyone listening to the webinar today has any questions that you would like any of us panelists to answer, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A box, and we will try to circulate those questions at the end to make sure that we've covered all of our bases. And so, Bill, thank you for that segue and also for the earlier very kind introduction. I wanted to just talk for a few minutes today about a new threat that actually comes from the government in instances where an organization, including a healthcare organization, is the unfortunate victim of a ransomware attack. And I say it's a new threat because traditionally, financial institutions and companies that did cross-border business were the primary organizations that had to be concerned about what we call OFAC, so the Office of Foreign Assets Control. But as of recently, just in October of this year, OFAC, as we call it in the industry, released an advisory where they basically said that victims of ransomware attacks and the companies that assist them in responding to ransomware attacks also have to be aware that they have to comply with OFAC regulations as well. And so to try to put that in context, there's a quote on the slide here where the government has described its position as it relates to these types of payments. And it has basically said that companies that facilitate ransomware payments to cyber actors on behalf of victims, including financial institutions, cyber insurance firms, and other companies, not only encourage ransomware payment demands, but also risk violating OFAC regulations. And so in preparing for today, we thought that given that OFAC regulations are not always on the front of mind of healthcare organizations, it will be helpful for me to provide some context and some background as to what OFAC does, what measures OFAC has in place, and then also what are some of the civil and criminal penalties for an OFAC violation. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about what this means for you and your companies as you try to navigate the compliance landscape. So the first question is, what is OFAC? And in short form, OFAC is an arm of the Treasury Department that enforces economic sanctions against targeted foreign countries, foreign regimes, and people who are deemed to pose a national security threat to the United States. And so historically, you may have heard of the Clinton list or OFAC regulations as they applied to narcotics traffickers in the 90s. Well, the OFAC sphere of influence has expanded in recent years to also include cyber actors and the types of companies and individuals around the world that perpetrate ransomware attacks. So OFAC publishes a list of people and organizations called, this is in quotes, specially designated nationals, or the SDN list. Those individuals and companies' assets are blocked, and U.S. persons and U.S. companies are generally banned from dealing with those people or businesses, whether directly or indirectly. This is often called the OFAC list. And so by way of example, when I was a prosecutor at the United States Attorney's Office in Miami, I led an investigation along with OFAC regulators and the FBI of people who were committing violations of the OFAC regulations. These are criminal violations involving people here in South Florida who were sending money overseas to people that they knew to be on the SDN list or the OFAC list. And for criminal violations, the potential penalties will depend on the specific charge as well as on the amount of money involved in the transaction. But for today, I wanted to focus on the civil side of OFAC enforcement because that is much more likely to come up in the instance of a ransomware attack. And so just very generally speaking, OFAC can impose civil penalties for violations based on strict liability, which means that you or your organization can be held civilly liable even if you did not know or have a reason to know that you were engaging in a transaction with someone on the OFAC list when you paid a ransomware amount to get your data back. The penalties for these violations can also vary by the amount of the violation as well as based on certain circumstances. And so by way of example, OFAC recently reached settlements with Berkshire Hathaway for about $4 million, with a company called Generali Global Assistance, which is a travel company, for about $5 million. And then in September with the telecom company for $890,000. And these settlements are negotiated after a long and sometimes tedious process where the company has to negotiate with the government over the amount of penalty that they should be forced to pay as a result of either a knowing or unknowing violation of OFAC regulations. And so circling back to the OFAC advisory from October, as you know, and as we've discussed today, and as you may know well, cyber actors are currently targeting organizations around the country, but in particular healthcare organizations, because they store tremendous amounts of patient information and have large amounts of employees. In short, they're a perfect target if you are trying to obtain the personal identity information of victims. The advisory from OFAC describes an attack that started in 2015 using ransomware software that targeted the US government, the city of Atlanta, as well as a large healthcare company. And in 2018, in response to that attack, OFAC designated 2 people on the OFAC list. So as the number of cyber criminals on the OFAC list grows, it's important that healthcare companies and other organizations that are otherwise regulated recognize that they also are subject to the OFAC regulations. And in the event that a ransomware payment ends up in the hands of a person or an entity that is banned by OFAC, it can result in several penalties. Again, even if you did not know that the people that you were dealing with were banned on the OFAC list. And so to mitigate these risks, the first step, and oftentimes the best step, is prevention. And the Treasury Department has acknowledged that the importance of developing a sanctions compliance program that goes along with the compliance programs that your organization already has in place. The sanctions compliance program should contain the following components. First of all, management commitment to complying by OFAC's regulations, a risk assessment, internal controls that you develop along with your compliance team, testing and auditing on a regular basis, as well as training for anyone on your staff that may come into contact with the process for negotiating and ultimately deciding whether to pay for a ransomware incident. And in short, having an effective compliance program in place will help your organization avoid an inadvertent OFAC violation, and also is an important factor that the government will view favorably in the event that an OFAC violation occurs. And on the topic of external risks, I also wanted to just talk briefly about some other potential risks that can arise between your organization and its business associates. And so just briefly, because we are going to end up running short on time, I just wanted to point out that oftentimes when a ransomware incident or other type of cyber attack occurs, there's not only the company that is the direct victim, but there could also be other companies with which you have contracts that could be indirect victims. And most contracts between vendors and companies do not account for or anticipate a cyber incident. And so I just wanted to point out that in Florida, as well as in other states around the country, there's a developing body of case law that says in the event of a cyber attack that leads to financial losses, in the contractual situation, the party who is in the best position to prevent the fraud by exercising reasonable care suffers the loss. And so what we are oftentimes recommending to our clients who operate in this space is that when you are using contracts with vendors or other service providers, you take into account that you can add in provisions that delegate risk in the event of a cybersecurity incident or a ransomware attack that causes losses to you, your customers, or your patients. And with that, I will turn it back over to Henry and to George to talk about ways to prevent becoming victim of a ransomware attack.
Thank you very much, Jonathan and Bill. Clearly, you don't want to call Bill or Jonathan if you had a ransomware situation. Let me rephrase that. If you have a ransomware situation, you want to call Bill and Jonathan, but hopefully you don't have to call them, correct? And ultimately, how do you do that and how do you prevent that? In the slide that we have right now published, those are all the different areas that your policy and procedure should be updated once you perform a ransomware assessment, correct? You cannot pretend that ransomware is not going to affect you. You cannot pretend that no one knew about the implications of ransomware in healthcare, as we've been seeing different notices from the Health Department of Human Health Services, FBI, and things like that. In addition to, outside of the uncomfortable business experience of ransomware, in Europe, we've seen that there have been published cases of like a person dying due to ransomware, because ultimately this person was joining or entering an ER, and the ER was hit with the ransomware, so they were not able to provide the services to take care of the patient. So ransomware is not something we want to be playing, all right? So the first thing you want to be doing is you need to perform a risk assessment, a risk analysis of the potential threats and your current safeguards to determine how likely is going to be the impact for ransomware in your organization. So that's the risk analysis, and that's the first option situation. The next 3 slides and the next 10 minutes, I'll be talking about all the different areas that actually will help you conduct this risk analysis. So again, you're going to do the risk analysis. You're going to perform a risk management, which is performing and assessing what are the controls. If you identify that you have a gap in some controls, how are you going to manage your risk? You should be making sure that you have enough logs for you to determine what is a different activity, if there's potential ransomware being deployed within your network. How are you training your folks to help you prevent from the transmission of ransomware? Your security incident process, how have you updated to make sure that you're addressing ransomware? Contingency plan, Bill talked about it, disaster recovery. This should not be a new conversation for healthcare entities or business associates. Access controls. If you minimize the amount of people that have access to sensitive data, by design, it should be helping you. And finally, how are you maintaining and how are you testing that all these controls actually are working as designed? And typically, how do you do this? You can do it. You can take it by yourself, or you can bring third parties to help you. But this is not something that you want to be just not taking lightly. So this slide, we have 5 points, correct? In my mind, these are the 5 points that actually will help you minimize the impact of ransomware, okay? If you don't have any of these 5, you're potentially increasing the likelihood of ransomware affecting you and potentially affecting the impact. So the first one is maintain backups, okay? And they use what's called the 3-2-1 rule. What does that mean? You need to have 3 pieces of information: your production data, that's number 1, and then you're gonna have 2 different sets of data which are not connected to the network in different media, correct? So that way, if something happens to your production data, which is what would happen from an encryption perspective, which is what Henry showed us before, then at least you have 2 other methods for you to recover. So maintaining offline encrypted backups and make sure you can restore from your backups, it's like rule number 1, correct? So hopefully if you don't have the 3-2-1 rule, this webinar will help you start thinking, how can we get there and what we can accomplish? 2, incident response plan. A lot of times our clients will have a simple incident response plan documented. You want to make sure that it's been updated to address ransomware, correct? And that means you have an understanding of how potentially ransomware will affect you, so you can determine how the best way for you to manage the incident. So do a tabletop exercise. You don't have to test everything, but just sit down with the people who are part of your team, IT, privacy, information security, management, and just do an hour, 2-hour meeting in which you guys talk about what would happen if you get affected by an incident. Now, this is getting a little more technical, which is saying your network. Make sure that your main infrastructure, which is what we call the main controllers, has been as secure as possible. It's been patched to the latest OS. It has been configured and has been designed with security in mind. 4, and I hope by now all of us are using this, multi-factor authentication, all right? What does that mean? It is you have your user ID, password, and then you're gonna get a third piece of information through your phone or through an app anytime you need to access your network remotely or anytime you need to access sensitive data internally. So multi-factor authentication is something that it is very key. And if you don't have it, I highly recommend you start thinking about how you can get there. Finally, apply the principle of least privilege. What does this mean? Is assess your environment and determine who needs to have access to what. A lot of times we've seen this with a lot of our clients, that they have a really good understanding from a user perspective, from an employee perspective. Nurses should only have access to this, or doctors should only have access to this module. And that is great. You're doing a fantastic job. but go back into the IT aspect of it and make sure that all of your network accounts and your service accounts that could potentially compromise have been designed with principle of least privilege. Sometimes, from an IT perspective, our goal is to make sure that your data is up and running, that you can have access to your systems. And a lot of times we have to do that, and we do that by creating these service accounts that allow all the systems to connect. But once those accounts are connected, increases the likelihood of a ransomware. So remember about this slide, and remember these 5 rules, because these will make your life a little bit easier. Now, this will minimize the impact of ransomware if you get affected by ransomware. But how do you ultimately prevent ransomware? And this is more regarding what Henry had mentioned in the beginning, which is saying, okay, when we have vulnerabilities and misconfigurations, correct? So how do you prevent that? Are you running scans on a periodic basis? Is that helping you identify different vulnerabilities? Have you made sure that all your potential open ports that are in your environment have been closed? And have you been able to disable key elements of pre-established configurations that are not needed? From a phishing perspective, are you guys implementing phishing simulation awareness training? Highly recommended. It's amazing how people do learn through phishing simulation training. So if you don't have it, you should start looking into it. Is your email gateway properly configured to filter emails that potentially have malware, ransomware? Have you enforced different policies that actually help prevent spoofing, like DMARC? And ultimately, when you have Office files, have you considered disabling macro scripts, because that ultimately is sometimes the way that it gets in. So here you're looking at 2 different vectors, one being phishing, the other one being internet-facing vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. And these are key takeaways that you guys should be looking into it to help you minimize the likelihood of your ransomware being delivered. Malware infection. At the end, ransomware is a piece of malware, correct? So does your antivirus is properly updated? Do you have antivirus in all the different devices that it's affecting your network? Do you have endpoint security that actually can identify behavioral analysis within your network that actually can stop the ransomware? So, or do you have an intrusion detection system or an intrusion prevention system? But these are all highly recommended solutions that actually can help you prevent when the network starts feeling or sensing something different that actually can help you stop your ransomware attacks. Finally, and this is one that I highly recommend, is like look at all your third-party connections, correct? A lot of times, there's no way we can conduct business by we performing all the services by ourselves, so we need to outsource functions, correct? Whether it's a platform here or we need to bring vendors into our site, make sure that you're actually monitoring and looking at those systems. A lot of times we've seen with our clients that ransomware has nothing to do with their network. It has to do with a third party or a vendor that they were using. But ultimately, even you cannot say it's the vendor's fault. You still have to take ownership and responsibility due to the privacy requirements. So make sure you understand who are you doing business, correct? Who are you allowing to get into your house, and make sure that you actually have a vendor that has probably better security than your own, or at least they have the same security. So saying that, I think I would like to go into Bill and Jonathan, and we can do, maybe we can do the closing remarks, and then we can do probably some Q&A.
This is Bill, and then I'll turn it over to Jonathan for questions and answers. First of all, we want to thank everyone for attending today. There's actually, this is, I've been to seminars where like this subject, this is a day-long subject. So we're trying to, get it all in 55 minutes or an hour. So it's sort of a high-level view, but I think you can see that it's a very it's a very important thing, and it's unfortunately it's something that is relevant to us today, and particularly to those of you in the healthcare industry. You really need to make sure that you're taking this seriously, and that you're devoting the resources to it. I know one of the things in the healthcare industry is, having been doing this for 20 plus years, is oftentimes compliance and security and things like that. These are costs. They're not bringing in any revenue. They're adversely affecting our bottom line. Oftentimes it's how it's viewed, but it's not. This is what's required to do business safely now. And by doing this, your return on investment is actually really measurable by eliminating potential losses and damage, and not just financial loss. And let's not, as Jorge brought up, it's not just the dollars that we might have to lose in the regulatory. It could also impact patient health. We have so many of our systems and the Internet of Things and everything, they're so interconnected that, we can't have infusion pumps shutting down. We can't have other devices doing that. Forget about the liability part. We're talking about human lives. And so we do need to make sure that we're taking that very, very seriously. So with that, I'll turn it over to my partner, Jonathan.
Sure. Thank you, Bill. So one of the questions that we had in kind of relates to this theme, and it's actually a question that I had listening to everyone else's presentations today. So a lot of times my work is responding once an incident has occurred. But the question asked, and I think a question that may be in other people's minds, is for both the Gunster side as well as the Kaufman side, who do you work with on the front end in order to help clients prepare to prevent and also to respond when one of these types of incidents occurs?
I'll jump in first, Jorge and Henry. On the front end, there are all sorts of third parties out there that can assist you if you're not able to do it in house. But you want to make sure that you have a third party that's assisting you or to help prepare for this. And oftentimes you'll do that through conducting your risk assessment or your risk analysis so that you get a footprint of what's going on in how information is living and residing and flowing in your organization. And then you can find out how best to protect that. I would say though, it's very, I've seen, unfortunately, there are lots of situations where some third parties really overpromise and they don't have the technical expertise to give you the services that you need. So you do want to make sure that you do your due diligence when you're bringing in these outside people to help you, or even in building your own internal team. Jorge, Henry, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I have a thought. Like ultimately, and we come from Russ and we provide these services. So feel free to reach out to us. We'll be more than happy to help you guys. Now, but when you think of a vendor and a vendor that can help you, I think there's a couple of things you want to be looking at, which is, what is the stability of your team, correct? Has your team been in the organization for a couple of years? Are they using contractors? 2, what is their expertise within the healthcare industry, correct? Healthcare is very unique. Healthcare has very unique requirements. So you want to make sure that the vendor you're bringing in actually can provide you with the solutions going forward, and they're not learning on your dime. So that is my recommendation. From an incident response, if you have a cyber liability, a lot of times they'll help you with that aspect. So always make sure that you have a clear understanding of what your cyber liability will do for you guys. But Henry, you have any recommendations how to find a hacker?
I would definitely go back to making sure that whoever is helping you has the technical expertise to actually do so. Sadly, more than a couple of times I've seen companies that just go with something cheap. Like the example that I mentioned, when you have a managed service provider, so you're basically trusting somebody else to handle all of your IT infrastructure, and if they don't know very well what they're doing, how to protect it, or more importantly, how to react when something bad happens, it will just create more hurdles in the process of trying to fix that. Again, from other service providers, having an intrusion prevention and detection system, it's probably going to be one of your key elements of protection. It's also even pretty common to add something that is called a honeypot. So basically you have a purposely vulnerable device within your network, but it's being monitored. So the moment somebody tries to do something weird in it, you're going to be alerted. And there are different techniques for that, but definitely that's something that you might want to consider, so that you can have some sort of a preemptive or very early warning before you find yourself just scrambling trying to solve the issue.
And we have one more question right before we run out of time. The question is, have we seen a best practice for limits of liability? For example, 1 million of coverage, 10 million of coverage. Is there a best practice standard deductible that you've seen in the marketplace? And I'll direct that to Bill. And then Bill, you can also close us out once you've answered.
Sure. You know, I mean, it's really sort of an evolving field, and you know, sort of like using the example for this audience, like we would do for medical malpractice limits and the type of liability we risk retention we accrue for that. We really need to look at the type of data we have and what would be the impact of that data going out there. So, you know, it's really easy. You know, I mean, a lot of times I think people just kind of throw a dart and say, okay, we'll do 5 million, 10 million, things like that. You know, it's the larger the organization, the more thought we need to put into it for being able to respond. And then, you know, again, like with any sort of risk management, you know, we have to look at the risk retention. What are we comfortable absorbing ourselves versus trying to outsource. So yeah, I see we're over the time. Please feel, if you've got any other questions, please feel free to shoot us an email. We'd be happy to try to help you. And thank you so much for being here. And we enjoyed it, and we really appreciate your attendance today. Thanks.